Alright, so today we're going to talk about mixing, and I really haven't been able to avoid talking about it, but today we're going to be talking about it in terms of FL Studio. So I have a very basic, drum line that I put together, nothing you haven't seen before. So if I play that whole thing in the song, you can hear what it sounds like. Now you'll notice that next to each one of these sounds, we have a number here, like 1, 2, 4. This one is blank. I'm going to go ahead and route this to number 3 and then route this to number 4. And what that will do is if I go to View and then go to Mixer, this will bring up the mixer. And you essentially have a channel for every single instrument. So for example, I have my kick routed to number 1. So that means it's going to be routed to the insert here, number 1. And I can even go here, I can mute all of these. So the only thing that's not muted right now is my kick. And if I click on play, you can see every time the kick happens, the volume meter is going up in insert number 1. And if I add in my snare real quick, all I'm doing is unmuting it right now. You can see that happening in insert number 2. And all the same, I have my hat now routed to number 3, and then I have another hi-hat that's routed to number 4. So you can see all 4 of them operating. And what the mixer really does is give me control over all of these different sounds. So if I want to label these, I can do that. I can rename them. I can call this kick. So I'll go ahead and do that for all of these real quick. Now I have all 4 of these channels labeled. All of these other ones are all empty for now, but I can put more instruments in them when I start making more. The very first thing that I can do is, adjust the volume. If I want to, turn the snare, to make it very, very low, I can do that. Or if I think my hi-hats are too loud, I can turn them down a bit. And then let me turn my snare back. I can right-click and reset. That'll put it back to where it started. Another thing that I could do is I can pan to the left or pan to the right. Basically, what that'll do is if you have headphones or speakers, it'll basically put all of the volume either in the left or in the right, or, a fraction of the volume, depending on how far to the right you have it. Like right now, this is panned 23% right, according to the hint panel. So 23% of the volume will be more directed in the right speaker or the right headphone. However, I don't really want to do that, so I'm going to right-click and reset. In addition to that, what I can do is I can go over here where we have all the effect slots, and I can left-click, and I can pick one of these effects that are already built into the program. For example, Fruity Parametric EQ2, and this is a visual equalizer. I have shown you one briefly in Reaper. As of now, there are no effects being enabled. I have 7 different bands, and each one of these bands will control a different frequency, and I can actually change what frequency it controls. Right now it controls about 1105 hertz, but I can change that, and now it controls 1484 hertz. And essentially what the EQ does is basically increase, or it will decrease, a certain frequency in your sound. Let me right-click and then reset. Now this will be back to where it started. So for example, if I left click here, I can actually change. They have different types of filters. So for example, this one's called a high pass filter, and I can change the frequency, and then I can even increase, this part of the frequency. And what that'll do is basically filter out all of the low end here. So you'll only be able to hear the higher areas. You can hear what that sounds like. Remember, this is only being applied to the snare. You can see that, as I adjust it, the further up it is, it's filtering out more of the lower frequencies in the sound. Alternatively, they also have a low pass filter, which kind of does the opposite, and it will only allow in the lower frequencies. So let me right click and reset this back to default. And for the record, this knob right here is a quick way to access a lot of really common types of filters. However, you can also technically do that if you play around with it enough. This is kind of a high pass filter where it's just filtering out all the lows. However, it's not quite as abrupt as this one that obviously filters out all of the lower frequency. But if you mess around with these knobs enough, you can achieve pretty much any sound. And you can even see a label here where they're talking about, these are the mid frequencies right here. These are the high mid frequencies. Then you have kind of your bass frequency and then your sub bass. But setting all this back to default, one thing you can do when you're trying to perform an EQ is you can take a band like this and you can kind of notice that this column right here is associated with this fifth band. So I can move this to the left or to the right using this knob. And then this knob will basically decrease or increase the width of it. So I'm really focused on one small frequency right now. And, I can move this around. And what I can do is I can play it and listen to it. And you can listen and try to find a certain frequency that you want to change. So, if you find like some kind of sound that you really don't like in your, snare or your vocal or whatever you're mixing, it's important to note that, even though I'm talking about a snare right now, this is, applied to any type of EQ. They all function essentially the same way, and I want to give you a dynamic understanding. So whenever you're applying EQ to anything, whether that be a beat, whether that be you mixing your vocals, these same principles apply. So let's say that, you find a frequency, this particular one, 1747, you don't like it or you don't want it, in the sound. At that point, then you can just, move this knob down and you can filter that out. And you can also increase the bandwidth, and that will increase more or less of the amount of frequencies that you're actually filtering out. Because here you can tell it's really concentrated where you're only mixing out 1747. However, if you increase the bandwidth, what you're doing is you're filtering out a lot more of the frequencies around that particular frequency. So a lot of this is really just kind of listening to it and, experimenting, moving things around, and basically determining, what sounds right. How much of this frequency do I really want to remove from the track or from the sound? How many of the adjacent frequencies do I really want to remove from the sound? It really depends depending on the type of track that you're making. There's no, hard and fast rule where you can say, always do it like this. You have to have a dynamic understanding of it so that when you're listening, you can know, this is what I need to change about this particular sound. You could be mixing a drum on top of a bass sound, and both of those are very low frequency. So in that case, you might want to filter out some of the lower sounds in the bass in order to make sure that the drum can come through. What's important to know about mixing is that if you have too many sounds going on and all of them, are in the same frequency, like let's say that we have, 8 different instruments and all of them are really heavy in the 1432 area. What's going to happen is it's going to get really, really saturated, and you're going to have all these instruments creating a muddled and not very good sound. It's kind of like when you're mixing a bunch of colors together. If you mix in red and blue and green and, yellow and all these colors together, they just become a murky brown. And it's kind of like that with, sounds, where you have too many things going on at once and they just don't sound good together. So a lot of the times what you want to make sure you're doing is that you're giving room for the frequencies that you really want to shine through your track. Like if you're making something and you really want the vocals to be a prominent feature of your song or your beat, then you want to make sure that you're allowing a little bit of room for them to breathe. Now that doesn't mean you have to filter out all of the sound. You don't need to completely get rid of it like this. You can just kind of lower it and give a little bit more room for the vocals to happen. And that's about all I really wanted to cover as far as EQ is concerned. It's really good to know what a high pass and a low pass filter sound like. They're very common. And even though I'm using this particular parametric EQ, pretty much all EQs are exactly the same. Not all of them are going to be visual in this way. These are considered graphic EQs. But no matter what type of EQ you have, it still has the same principle where you're, adjusting certain bands and certain frequencies, either higher or lower, and, cutting or adding in those frequencies. When you boost it higher, you're just increasing the volume of those frequencies. So real quick, I'm going to get rid of this altogether and delete. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is compression, and I'm going to use one that I like called Rough Rider. I'm going to be applying this to the kick, so I will not be applying it to the snare. I'm only applying it to the kick. And again, I want you to remember that even though I'm talking about a specific, plugin and these knobs, Rough Rider is a compressor and it functions pretty much identical to every other compressor in the world. Now, different compressors might sound different based on the way that they were engineered and created by the, software designers or by the hardware designers if you're using an actual physical compressor. But in the essence, they all kind of have the exact same features to them. So pretty much every compressor is going to have a ratio of some kind. It's going to have an attack. It's going to have a release. It's going to have, makeup. They might call it gain, but it's also, makeup. And then often they'll have a threshold instead of the word sensitivity, but they call it sensitivity here. But it's the same thing as threshold. And the way to think about a compressor is essentially you're taking all the very loud points of your audio and making them quieter, but then you're also taking all the very quiet points of your audio and making them louder. And it does affect the way that your audio sounds. The ratio is essentially exactly that. You have a 3-to-1 ratio, meaning that if you have a sound that's 3 decibels, it will compress it down to 1 decibel. The sensitivity or the threshold is essentially how loud the volume needs to be before it actually kicks in. So notice that no matter what I put my ratio to, if I play it and the sensitivity is too high, this is the maximum it can be. Let me go ahead and click play. It doesn't really matter what the ratio is because the compressor is not really being enacted. However, if I turn the sensitivity all the way up to the maximum level, and I have this set to maybe 4-to-1, you can tell that it's really compressing the volume down, 4-to-1. Now I can also change the sensitivity. And conversely, it doesn't matter how high my sensitivity is. If I have it all the way up and the ratio is 1-to-1, all that means is it's going to keep it exactly the same. It's going to take a 1 decibel and turn it into a 1 decibel sound. So let me click play. You can tell that this is not affecting the sound in any way. So what you want to do is combine the ratio and the sensitivity in order to compress your sound. And if you're working with vocals, you'll probably want something around 3-to-1 or 4-to-1. It's probably unlikely that you're ever going to need to go much higher than, 6. However, you have the option, obviously, to compress the hell out of it. But you also want to consider, how sensitive it is. If you're only applying a small amount of it, then, a lot of compression doesn't really sound that bad. Realistically, though, you're going to probably want this to be around, 3 or 4, maybe even 5. At the end of the day, it's completely up to you to listen to the sound and kind of hear what sounds good. Because, every vocal, every drum, every music instrument is all going to sound different. So, depending on what type of sound that you're trying to achieve for your song, there really are no hard and fast rules for, what steps to follow. That being said, you don't want your sensitivity to be so low that it's not doing anything, and you don't want it to be so high that it doesn't sound good. I mean, you can tell I can barely even hear the kick in there. Another thing I can do is even if I turn my sensitivity up really high, what this will do is basically make up. It'll just turn up the volume. That's essentially all this does. So even though everything has been compressed to the point where all the loud vocals are a lot quieter and all the quiet vocals are going to be louder, the makeup basically takes all of that and amplifies it. At some point, though, there is a maximum, I can only increase this by 30 decibels at the most. So I'm just going to put this around here, let you hear what it sounds like. The only two other knobs I really want to talk about are the attack and the release. Attack is essentially how quickly the compression happens. So if I have it at 0 milliseconds, basically what this is saying is that this will happen immediately. However, if I add this, it'll be like a delay. So the compressor will happen, but it's going to take a little bit more time before it happens. However, if you increase the attack too much, then, it might take too long for it to actually do anything. So I'll have this around, 4 milliseconds. And then the release is essentially the opposite, where, the compression has already happened, but it's how quickly it goes back to normal. And again, you're really just kind of listening to everything and trying to figure out what sounds the best to you. Now you might want to add in, both an EQ and a compressor. So I'm just going to throw on a low pass filter. And you can even adjust these knobs right here, which really kind of give you the ability to reduce the amount of the effect that you have. So if I were to turn this all the way to 0, you won't hear the EQ at all. So now I have it at about halfway. The next thing I want to talk about real quick is I want to talk about reverb. So if I go here, and they already have, a bunch of options here. If you don't see what you're looking for, there might be some more if you go to more plugins. I'm just going to type in verb. And so you have Fruity Reverb 1, Fruity Reverb 2, then I have a VST that I installed called Epic Verb. I'm just going to click on Reverb 2 for now. And for the record, I'm only applying the reverb right now to the snare, so it's not going to be applied to any other, not the kick, not the hi-hat. This is Fruity Reverb 2, and again, all reverbs are different, but this is kind of a dynamic understanding where no matter what you're doing, it doesn't matter if you're using, a snare or a vocal or, some other instrument. It doesn't matter if you're using this exact plugin or using FL Studio. All reverbs kind of have the same principle to them, and a lot of them will share a lot of the same knobs. For example, having, the amount of dryness and wetness, almost every reverb will have that built in. So here, we have our size, and you can actually see visually what that means. It's kind of like, the size of the room that you're in. And remember that reverb is more or less basically the same thing as an echo. If you're talking and it bounces off the wall and it comes back to you, that is an echo. That is a delay. However, if you are so close to the wall that it happens pretty much instantaneously, then it's basically a reverb. So real quick, I'll let you hear what that sounds like. So if I reduce the size here, now conversely, another thing I can do is I can turn down the wetness all the way and then turn up the dryness, and really all that does is basically get rid of the reverb. So if it's 100% dry, however, if I turn the dryness down and then make it 100% wet, you can hear what that sounds like. It's really just the amount of effect that you have going on. Let me reset both of these. Another thing I can do is I can use this knob right here, and that will change the amount of mix. So, if, this is 100% of the effect. However, I don't want to include all of that, so I'll put it down to around 50%. If I turned it all the way down, there would be no effect. But I'm going to put this back. Another thing with this particular plugin, they have a high cut and a low cut. Basically, all that means is, if I set this all the way down, it's not going to cut out any of the higher frequencies. It is basically setting the minimum frequency that'll start being filtered out. Kind of like what we were looking at with the EQ. So, for example, I'll play this. So you can hear that the higher I have this frequency, the less of the actual high frequencies in the sound you can hear. So if I have this all the way here, it's going to be cutting out pretty much most of the higher sounds. And conversely, low cut does the exact opposite of that. And you can hear that it's removing a lot of the low frequencies in the reverb. Then we also have a delay button, which, is exactly what it sounds like. Let me set this back to normal. You probably wouldn't want to have a delay on a snare, but if you have like vocals or something, you might want to use that delay, and then you can set it to be tempo, whatever the tempo of the project is. So here it's at 91. And the higher this knob is, the more of a delay you have. You can hear, how delayed it is before that reverb actually comes in and happens. Another thing to remember about reverb is that it's a sound just like anything else, and it has a lot of frequencies. So it can, if you have too many different instruments going on and they all have reverb on them, and you have a lot of reverb and you're not like trying to control the amount of reverb that you have, then it can definitely get really muddled up. It can have a lot of frequencies overlapping and sound bad. So another thing you want to think about is, you don't want to overload and have too much reverb, but you definitely also don't want to have no reverb at all and then have your sound, really dry. So again, with everything, it's always a matter of listening and, playing around with knobs and trying to make sure that, they sound the way that you want them to sound. There are definitely people that will spend, days, if not weeks, trying to mix one particular track, especially, if you're talking about a professional, industry standard, song, because, you're talking about a lot of money riding on everything sounding perfect. But I'm going to turn down the delay, turn off that tempo. I'm going to lower the size a little bit and maybe increase the high cut, and then maybe I'll turn down the mix level a bit. So the reverb is still there, but you can't really hear it quite as much. Now, apart from EQ and compressing and reverb, there are all kinds of different effects. Most of them are, on some level, just some kind of distortion. They might be adding a little bit of white noise or some kind of, fuzziness to it. Mixing is definitely a very complex and, in-depth field that, if I were to go through everything, it could be an entire series on its own. There are definitely people that can, learn how to do this stuff for years and never actually master every facet of it. Another thing to consider is, when you talk about going into sound design, when I have VSTs like this, they come with a lot of built-in presets, For example, I can, click on this and automatically get like an ocarina sound. But the reality is somebody somewhere, basically played around with all these different knobs and tried to make it into this sound. And the cool thing about synthesizers is that theoretically, you can make pretty much any type of sound at all, by, playing around with all these different knobs and getting all the right settings so that, it sounds like a piano, or it sounds like a guitar, or it sounds like a bass sound. You really have so much freedom to manipulate and go through all these sounds and really customize everything to the point where there really is no limitation to the actual sound that you can make. The only real limitation is your actual skill level and how much you're willing to go out there and learn on your own and try to figure all these things out. However, for, this video series, this is not about mixing. It's not about sound design, which are two completely independent things that you can spend, years learning how to do. This series is not about music theory, which is, another thing that you can spend years learning how to apply. Like I've said many times, it's really about kind of hitting all of these different topics and trying to give you just, an introduction, a step into the pool, not diving all the way into the deep end. Now, there is one final thing I wanted to cover. I have this plugin called Nexus that I downloaded, and I already walked through the process of installing plugins like this. You can buy Nexus 3, which I believe is $200, and they have, tons of different, expansion packs that also cost money. And, kind of determine for yourself whether or not you want to be making all these sounds yourself, or, if you can get a program like Nexus where a lot of these sounds have already been made for you. So these are all different, sounds that people have already put together, and, you find something you like. I did real quick just want to talk about a few other things. This is a very common thing to have a ADSR, which is an attack, a decay, a sustain, and release. And even if I were to go to one of these drum sounds over here, you can go to the settings here, and you'll see right here we have the same thing. You have an attack, you have a decay, you have a sustain, and a release. This is a very common thing, so it's good to know what they all are. So the attack, as I talked about, in a compressor, basically how fast it happens. If I turn this all the way down, if I click on the sound, it's pretty much immediate. But if I, put this all the way up and I press it, I'm going to press it right now. And you can see maybe on the left side, the volume's going up, but, the attack is so delayed that you don't even hear a sound actually coming in. So let me put it right here. So it's basically just taking longer before the sound actually comes in. So if you want the sound to come in, at full velocity and full sound, right at the beginning, you'll want this all the way down to here. The next thing you have is release, again, referring back to the compressor, kind of the same thing, where the sound is going, but the release is how fast, the sound kind of disappears. So if I have this here, it takes a while before the sound goes away, but if I turn this all the way down, the tail end of it kind of, goes away a little bit quicker. Then you also have the sustain, which is basically how long the note itself holds. So if I turn this down, versus if I turn this all the way up, I'm not doing anything different. I'm just holding down the key. The difference is the sustain has been elongated and the note just held for a longer period of time. So I can turn this down, I can turn down the release and the sustain and then the decay. And the decay is a little harder to understand, but it's basically how long it takes to get from the attack to the designated sustain level. So whatever the sustain level is, how long it takes to get from here to here. I'll just go ahead and, turn that all the way down. You can hear that this happens pretty quickly. And if I turn this all the way up. So again, that's another thing where you want to play around with the knobs and try to find, what sounds best to you. What are you going for? What kind of sound are you going for? Now then you also have, reverb, which we've, basically talked about. This one also has a high cut. You can turn this off altogether. And then delay is already, built in. And you can increase the actual delay. If I increase the time, it's basically increasing, how long the delay, takes before it kicks in. But again, I can just turn that off with this, button right here. So a lot of it is really just a matter of going through, playing around with things, and trying to get the sound that you're looking for and putting it all together. All right, so real quick, I just put together a little melody. It's only 1 bar long, so I'll shorten that. In fact, I'm going to turn the reverb off altogether here. And I'll turn the decay down. So what I can do is I can take this and put it into number 5. So now it's in the mixer. We can call this, Plux or whatever. I'll just call it Zelda. So now if we wanted to, we can go through, we can add in a compressor or we can add in an EQ, but we don't have to. I did want to add in some reverb. I had the option to add in reverb on Nexus here, but I took it off and I'm going to actually do it with this reverb just because I prefer it. Note that these buttons up here are presets, so. And then I can go here. They also have fast distortion, and really all distortion does is basically just that. It's kind of like add kind of a fuzzy sound to it. So I can turn down the amount of it. It's also worth noting that the actual order of everything does matter because, here the reverb will be applied first and then they're going to be applying the distortion to the reverb, and I don't want that. So I can go here and move up. And, I'm not going to cover every single, possible type of preset. There are some built-in presets here. There's also one in FL Studio that I quite like. It's called the Sound Goodizer. And it's really very simple. You only have 4 different knobs to pick from. And, you can either apply a lot of it or a little bit. And that's really all you can do. One other thing I wanted to make you aware of is that, FL Studio also has some cool things like gross beat. And essentially it will kind of, change up the rhythms and, sometimes it'll change up the melodies. This is really just something to play with and kind of, get an idea of what it is, you want. These are all different. And again, you have all kinds of presets that you can pick out of. For example, stutter. And in this particular case, I haven't done anything with the melody. I'm not really doing any of this. This is all, within the program, where it just basically goes through and adds in different types of gates and stutters and things like that. Again, another cool thing that you should check out, more, YouTube videos on if you want to learn more about it. The main things that I really think that people should, get a good grasp on, though, is equalization, compression, and, even reverb. Then after that, you definitely want to have like a solid foundation in music theory. But for now, I think, that's all I really wanted to cover. We talked about mixing. We talked about the ADSR envelope, which, if you recall, it's just the attack, the delay, the sustain, and the release. That's one of those things that I'm not really going to cover in this video, but you should definitely go out there and watch some videos on sidechaining once you have a really good grasp on EQ and compression. Then once you, kind of master all those things, you should look into automation. And I'm not going to get into that either. However, I will briefly talk about how, let's say, for example, in track 2, I have my piano going on. And you also have the freedom to do stuff where you right click and then you can go to create automation clip. And what this does basically is kind of give you more control over whatever that knob is that you just clicked. Like right here, I clicked on volume. I could have clicked on something else. I could have gone into my reverb and I could have, created an automation clip for my reverb. Now, it's highly unlikely that I would want to do that, but it's possible. And what you can do is use this automation, and that gives you more control over what's going on. So for example, this is only tied to my volume. So what that means is I can change this and increase the volume, or I can decrease the volume. So I can make it so that it starts out, pretty much mute, and then as the song goes on, it gradually increases the volume of the song. Alternatively, I could have done it the other way where I, start out really loud and then, decrease the volume. And that's also a good way to, kind of do transitions where you're kind of going from like one part of the song and then maybe you're going to add in like a different sound or, do a complete beat switch up. You can, use automation and, try to fade out your volume for one instrument and then bring in the volume for the next one. But I think, all these topics are pretty complex and pretty advanced. And I definitely want to, kind of lead people and say, okay, these are the things that you should be learning. And this is definitely one of those things. Once you have mastered everything else, once you've kind of gotten a good idea of how to work with EQ and how to work with compression and music theory and making a good beat, definitely, start looking at transitions and how to, manipulate your sounds a lot more. Remember again that I'm only using volume as an example here, but I could have done it with one of a number of different effects. So you can really accomplish all kinds of different sounds. Like I could have done this with an EQ, for example. Let me go ahead and throw on an EQ, and then I'll just have like a low pass filter. What I can do essentially is right click on my EQ here, the mix, and then create an automation clip, and then I can go through and I could do something crazy like this. All I'm doing is adjusting all these levels manually with my mouse, and then in actuality, I probably wouldn't do something like this, but it's just to give you an idea of what it would sound like if I'm constantly changing how much of the low pass filter that I'm applying. So these are all things to think about and consider. They're all different ways of having control over your beat and making smaller changes that go well beyond, just, putting together a composition that sounds good. But, you're actually controlling all of the sounds themselves. But anyway, that's about all I wanted to cover for this video. Thank you for tuning in. Hopefully you learned something. And until next time, keep making music.